Hey, David Brewster here, new episode of Chordplay, and this is the Chords of Exodus, and I've had a ton of requests to feature this legendary thrash metal band, and I love thrash metal. I just shared that image. There's just something about 80s Bay Area thrash metal. No offense to Anthrax, I know they're from New York, and I love them too. But back in the 80s, in the Bay Area, I don't know if it was something in the water or what, but it just erupted, and I can't get enough of it. I love it. And Exodus formed in Richmond, California. That's in the Bay Area. And they formed in Richmond, California in 1979. And a very famous guitarist was a founding member. I know you've heard of him before. And they've had some lineup changes, a number of them over the years. Definitely a powerhouse, dynamite, metal band. And I'm really excited to finally feature them here on the channel. And yes, if you're paying attention at home, I am wearing the Headbanger's Ball shirt that I wore in the Lizzie Borden Chordplay. But don't worry, I didn't wash it. So yeah, it's dirty. I couldn't wear a clean shirt to an Exodus lesson, because it's Exodus. So historically speaking, Kirk Hammett was a founding member of the band Exodus, and he played with the group from 1979 until 1983. That's when Dave Mustaine got kicked out of Metallica, and then they approached Kirk about joining forces. Kirk left Exodus and joined Metallica, and the rest is history. But I always found that really interesting. It was like Kirk's, early band. And for most fans, the classic, tag team duo of Gary Holt and Rick Hunolt, the Holt-Hunolt, duo of guitar, it just kicked ass. I mean, they definitely worked really well together, trading riffs and solos and stuff, and just, thrashing and moshing all over the place. Great stuff, for sure. And Rick left the band like 20 years ago, but he has returned, and, he's performed live with the group and stuff, like his guest appearances and stuff like that. But there's nothing like the classic Exodus back in the 80s. And there's always a lot of talk about the big four of metal: Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, and Anthrax. But in my opinion, there's a fifth, member for that club, and that's Exodus. But don't take my word for it. Here's a quote from Scott Ian from Anthrax, and he feels the same way I do. So the chord, bass, and rhythm guitar parts in this lesson came from 4 classic Exodus albums. Keep in mind they've released 12 studio albums, 3 live albums, 2 compilations, and 11 music videos. And those music videos are a big reason why I'm wearing this Headbanger's Ball shirt again, because I totally remember watching Headbanger's Ball back in the day and banging my head whenever Exodus videos came on. So anyway, here's the image with the album covers where I pulled music from. The opening, that's the song Deliver Us to Evil from the album Bonded by Blood, which is on the wall right there. I was really happy to see that released or reissued, earlier this year, and I grabbed it. And Deliver Us to Evil's like this. Something like that. So it starts with power chords, obviously, and we're doing... So that E to F, D, and then B flat A to that low E right there. And the second time, you're going to basically do that same E to F to D, and then grab that F right there, and then relocate to that low E. So there's 2 different hits with those chords. The first time... And then the second time, like that, and you do it again. And right there, you're going to hear the hi-hat, and he's counting it out, and you let that E power chord ring, and then the riff comes back, but then he starts hitting that low E in there, like this. That. almost the same riff, that E to F to D, that B flat to A. But then you hit that low E twice right there before that B flat to A. Then just start hitting that low E open there. And then that time you basically hang on that F a little bit longer and then go to that E. Like that. Now the last time you hear that riff, you hear the rhythm guitar do this, you know, F to E over and over. And then the second guitar grabs trills right there. Slide into that F note, then you've got E and F, you know, as a trill. And then that A to that G sharp right there. And then that C to that B. And then you just basically end. It goes in the next part of the song right there. But that last little tag right there. You know, something like that. But definitely Bonded by Blood is a classic, legendary album, and I love like a lot of the riffs and songs on that record. Next up's And Then There Were None. This is also from Bonded by Blood, a classic thrash riff here like this. Basic stuff here. A big slide on this G sharp, and you'll notice like at the beginning of a lot of Exodus songs there's a big slide usually, but right there, G sharp, and then you're basically hitting the low E and then this B flat to A and then C to A like that. And that's the thing about great thrash riffs. Usually if you slow them down, they have a groove to it, and then you speed it up and you kind of lose the groove, but there is a groove there. One of those great like annoy their neighbor riffs, you know, that'll definitely keep your neighbors up late at night. Next up's the riff from No Love from Bonded by Blood, and definitely this has kind of an odd rhythm to it, but if you start banging your head to keep time, you can kind of find like the rhythm like this. That weird like extra slide they throw in. It just kind of makes the rhythm a little funky, but there you're basically bashing that low E and that B flat right there. That's kind of what it looks like slow. That B flat, and then you're sliding this E to that D sharp. And then you're going to do that slide, and then that's where you add an extra, you know, slide right there, that A flat to G. So that's weird. So after that extra little slide, you go back to that B flat, the E to D sharp, and then you're doing the B flat, and then it's like an E5 chord hit slid off, and you're doing that. And then you hear that B flat, G, F sharp, G, low E open. And you're gonna find riffs like that in thrash with the weird kind of hiccups in the rhythm and those kind of jackhammer, you know, picking patterns and stuff. But that definitely kind of serves up this kind of different, you know, shift and that rhythmic kind of jump right there. Next up's the song Brain Dead. This is from the album Pleasures of the Flesh, and this definitely is a kick-ass thrash riff like this. like that. So it's really active and busy, kind of typical in the thrash metal rhythm style. And we're grabbing, you know, a low E and then a higher E, like power chord. And then that B flat, and then that A to E, and then a C power chord. So there's a lot happening just right off the bat there. Right? And then like that. And then you basically do the same thing again, almost. And right there, that E to E, and then that B flat A to E, and then you basically kind of just hit that low E, and then you walk into that top part of the E power chord. Like that. So slowly that first half. Then you do it again right there. And right there you can hit that B flat twice and then that A to E. And you do it again. Last time right there, instead of doing two B flats and then that A to E, you're doing this B flat A to E, B flat A to E, and then it kind of moves into the verse of the song right there. But that's a kick-ass riff. Next up's Til Death Do Us Part. This is also from the album Pleasures of the Flesh. There's two guitars here. The first guitar is doing this heavy kind of single note riff off the low E open. It kind of reminds me of like the Halloween theme, but simplified on guitar and played, you know, in a metal style. But like this. Right, nothing really hard to play there. It doesn't sound exactly like the Halloween theme. It just has that kind of, you know, rhythm to it where it's just repeating over and over and over with that motif. And then the interesting part is what the second guitar does with the chords underneath that. So you hear that riff, and then you hear a low E power chord and some dive bombs with a bar like this. And then I'm going to continue and play the next part like this. Something like that. And that riff just kind of continues, and then you hear that low E5 power chord. And then I'm hearing like this bigger E5, like that. Let that ring over that riff, and then you just move this part up, and there's an F5 right there, like an F5 over C. Don't play the low E right there though, but like that, big stack power chord. And then you go back to that E5. And then eventually it moves up to that big G5, like a G5 over D right there. So that's really cool because it makes that riff kind of shift in tonality depending on what chord, you know, is ringing behind it. E, or that F. Goes back to that E again. And then when it gets to that G, it kind of makes the riff kind of take on a different tonality or sound. That's really cool. Next up's the riff to the Last Act of Defiance. This is from the album Fabulous Disaster. That's a great Exodus album. And I mentioned earlier about riffs to annoy your neighbors with. Yeah, play this at 3 o'clock in the morning and your neighbors are going to hate you, like this. You know, something like that. And it's just obnoxious as hell. So like we're basically doing this. It's like a B flat flat 5 implied. You know, think of a B, you know, B flat power chord, but we're doing a flat 5. And then a G power chord. And then an A flat flat 5. And then that low E 5 power chord. Like that. And you can fret that however you want. I was kind of using like middle and third and then index and third, middle and third like that. You could also just move that index finger up, whatever you want to do. And that riff just kicks you right in the teeth. Next up's the song Cajun Hell from the album Fabulous Disaster. This is really cool. It's like this blues metal kind of song. And there's 2 guitars. There's also kind of 2 sections for this intro part. There's like the bluesy intro section, and then there's the thrashy part when it gets heavier, and then the song kind of kicks into high gear after that. But guitar 1 is doing this kind of bluesy... You know, that kind of riff, like the low E open, and I'm kind of hybrid picking there. Because you're sliding these chords like that partial B flat into a like the open D and the G for a partial G, partial A, and then partial E. Like so you're doing, and then you're playing the low E, you know, kind of against it. You know, something like that. And they start throwing in like these riffs. The MXR clone looper and loop that part because guitar 2 is doing this like Steve Cropper 6th kind of thing, like this. You hear there's guitar 1 and then guitar 2. Like that, just sliding into the 6th there on the 7th fret, and then slide into the 6th on the 6th fret, and then slide into the 5th fret 6th right there, and then you hear this like little partial like implied E7, you know, that G sharp and D you're sliding into like a half step below, and you hear like the bar dip, you know, it does all that again. After that bluesy intro, then it turns into a thrash thing, and we start doing... That's guitar 1, you know, the low E open, that B flat, low E open G, low E open A, low E open to E. So you're kind of mimicking like that bluesy riff we had, but then we just changed it into power chords right there. And then the Steve Cropper part, he starts adding like a higher note. Like that. When you put those guitars together, it just totally, you know, it's Cajun Hell. Okay, last but not least is Within the Walls of Chaos. This is from the album Impact is Imminent, and this is the opening riff, and I found this really interesting, especially the way the chords are moving, and they're kind of implying or outlining something really cool. But something like this. So we're basically doing these quick double hits on those chords, you could probably tell. And then we're also outlining a diminished seventh arpeggio with the progression. So that's really cool. So we're doing this, but we're doing that with chords, right? So we're doing like the low E and then 2 quick hits on that D5, low E, 2 quick hits on that B5. And then the low E open, 2 quick hits on that A flat 5. And then the low E, and then 2 hits on that F5. And then that, just let that E5 ring. Like that. You know, and it's super obnoxious and just in your face. Let that ring. You're going to do that again when you get that A flat. Instead of going to this low F, we're going to go to a higher F, bang that twice, and then end up on that E5 right there. Like that. So I just dig the way it's outlining diminished 7. And then we're also kind of bookending the riff with like a low F and E, and then a higher F and E, like that. Had tons of stuff like that up their sleeve. Really cool. All right, that's going to wrap this episode of Chordplay with this look at the Chords of Exodus. Definitely a great band, and I've been aware of them, you know, since I was a teenager, watching Headbangers Ball when I was a kid. And there's just something about 80s thrash metal. I don't know what it is. It's one of my guilty pleasures. You know, it's loud and fast and obnoxious, and the lyrics are typically kind of immature and offensive. But that's why I like it. It's this bouncy, playful, aggressive style of metal. And, you know, and there's something about it, like there's a sense of humor to the lyrics, even though they typically are kind of offensive or, you know, questionable. But, you know, definitely bands like Anthrax and plenty of thrash bands had a sense of humor with all the dark, heavy, evil-sounding stuff, too. And Exodus did, you know, as well. And there's just something about that, like the 80s, Headbangers Ball, thrash metal exploding, death metal, and all these other, you know, subgenres of metal exploding. And I remember when I was a kid, you know, I didn't know who was who, so I just remember listening to all of it, trying to understand, like, who's this, or what band is that, and there's King Diamond, and this, and this, and this. And with Exodus, it was the Headbangers Ball connection. That was my introduction to this band, watching some of their videos. And then having students over the years that were fans, and they wanted to learn some of these songs. And, cool band, for sure. If you haven't really listened to Exodus, dive in. They've got 12 albums, and plenty of stuff to listen to. So anyway, leave some feedback and comments. Please subscribe to Night Lessons, and I'll be back before you know with more content and material. Thank you.